Hi there, everybody. Hi, Dolores. Hi, Lana. Hi, Steve. And hi, Kay. Thank you all for coming. Please share. Thank you. Lana says, the Steve Monster.
Who says it?
I think you spelled it wrong, Lana.
What?
Yes, in this case, the Steve Monster is spelled S-T-E-V. Okay, folks. So, start with a little slide tonight. I just want to peg. Give a little image of the characteristics of the MMT lens. Lately, you've been hearing a lot of people say that MMT is a lens through which we see the world, and that it's a superior lens to mainstream economics. And I agree with that, but I think that needs a little more clarification. So here's my little more clarification. Knowledge claim networks are networks of statements about the way the world is, works, should, ought to work, will work in the future, and how knowledge of it can be developed for research and for policy. MMT practitioners use this knowledge claim network as a lens for viewing, understanding, explaining, predicting, describing, prescribing, and deciding what to do about the world around them. So that's my take from 100,000 feet of the nature of the thing that we know, is MMT. What the term MMT can also mean is an approach to the analysis of economics and society using the knowledge claim network we know, is MMT. So I just wanted to use that as a starting point. And now, I want to illustrate how ubiquitous the application of the MMT lens can be when it comes to the analysis, of issues. So, here we go. Let's share the first piece. This is a piece from Common Dreams on tax evasion, written by Jake Johnson. Quote, "This is tax evasion. The richest 1% of U.S. households don't report 21% of their income, analysis finds." Yes, when you don't report income that you have, that is tax evasion. There's a little sign saying tax the rich. Okay. A new analysis by IRS researchers and academics published on Monday morning estimates that the richest 1% of U.S. households don't report about 21% of their income. When did this post appear? It was yesterday. It was actually Monday morning. Okay. And they say, often using complex tax avoidance strategies that allow them to outmaneuver the federal government's increasingly rare audits of the wealthy. Led by two IRS researchers, as well as Daniel Reck of the London School of Economics, that's Reck, R-E-C-K, and Emmanuel Saez, okay, of the University of California at Berkeley, the new paper finds that 6 percentage points of the richest households' unreported income, quote, correspond to undetected sophisticated evasion, unquote, such as offshoring, pass-through businesses, and other avoidance tactics. Quote, from a policy perspective, our results highlight there is substantial evasion at the top, which requires administrative resources to detect and deter, unquote, the authors write. Quote, we estimate that 36% of federal income taxes unpaid are owed by the top 1%, and that collecting all unpaid federal income tax from this group would increase federal revenues by about $175 billion annually. So, folks, how are the rich paying for their buying of influence in your political system? Well, let's say they spend $15 billion a year on that. That's only $15 billion out of the $175 billion that they're saving on taxes. Makes you angry, doesn't it? There has been much discussion in the United States about the fact that the audit rate at the top of the income distribution has declined, unquote. The paper continues. Our results suggest that such low audit rates are not optimal. Who knew the IRS doesn't enforce tax laws when it comes to the ultra wealthy? I knew. I've known for a long time. The IRS has been quite open about it. They said they don't enforce it because it's too much trouble and too expensive to try to get them. Of course, this goes directly against the philosophy that was espoused by Rudy Giuliani of New York when he went against small offenders who used to wipe off the windshields of people coming into the city. It was the broken windows theory. If you want to get law and order in the city, don't let them break the windows. Well, of course, we don't treat the very rich like that. We let them break all the windows they want, which they've been doing with tax laws. They've been breaking the windows of the tax laws. It's too expensive to enforce. They're no longer breaking windows. So we won't do that. And so what they've been doing is they've been auditing people instead. I think primarily the middle class. I don't think they're auditing poor people very much because that's not cost effective either. Of course, if you were to nail 1 or 2 or 3 very rich people a year and put them in jail, you might not get any tax evasion anymore from the very, very rich. You don't have to have a very high success rate to scare the bejesus out of them, in my view anyway. ProPublica reported in 2019 that in recent years the IRS has audited the poor at around the same rate as the richest Americans, who have been the principal beneficiaries of years of budget cuts and staff shortages at the federal tax agency. Of course, this has been part of the Republican austerity program, and a nice side effect of that program has been that the IRS hasn't had enough staff to enforce the law against them. When the IRS actually conducts them, random audits, quote, do not capture the most tax evasion through offshore accounts and pass-through businesses, both of which are quantitatively important at the top, according to the new analysis. As a result, the paper's authors note the incomes of the wealthiest people in the U.S. and the country's overall inequality are significantly underestimated. Reck of the London School of Economics told the Wall Street Journal ahead of the paper's official release that the findings show there is more revenue than you might have thought at the very top. Quote, what's needed, argued Reck, is a broader strategy that involves increased scrutiny of pass-through businesses and investments in the comprehensive audits that the IRS does in its global wealth program. Last month, Ro Khanna, Democrat of California, introduced legislation that would provide the IRS with $100 billion in additional funding over a decade, so the agency can more closely examine and crack down on tax evasions by the richest Americans. The bill would invest in improvements to IRS technology, require audits of the richest individuals and corporations, and implement more strict income reporting requirements. Khanna's office estimates that to stop corporations and higher earners from avoiding taxes and enforce rules strictly, Cheaters Act would bring in $1.2 trillion in federal revenue over 10 years. Well, that's $102 billion out of the $175 billion. What else do we have to do to get the $175 billion per year, folks? Quote, we know our tax system is broken and it's long past time we start fixing it, Khanna said in a statement. The ultra-wealthy play by different rules than the rest of us. So what's involved here? Well, there's the fairness question, the idea that everybody should pay their fair share, of taxes. But that's not a perspective that particularly comes from the MMT lens. What comes out of the MMT lens is the idea that, well, even though so much has been escaping in taxation over the last 10 years, $1.75 trillion, that's not really money we needed necessarily, because, of course, the federal government was able to create the shortfall in money for the things that it needed to do. But what we have to remember is that for a lot of that time, the federal government was playing austerity games, presumably because there wasn't enough money coming in taxes to pay for things, quote, unquote. something else from the MMT perspective, though that money wasn't really important in funding things because taxes don't fund spending, it was important in relation to the failure to drain money out of the economy, thus creating more space for federal spending. In other words, if the deficits had been lower over that period of time, then perhaps there would have been a lot more appetite for deficit spending than there was during this period of time. Finally, while the final perspective is not suggested from this article, there are other articles, such as one that appeared today in Truth Out, which was by William Rivers Pitt, which basically said, oh, gee, if we had all this money, we could pay for a good part, if not all, of the infrastructure bill that Biden wants to pass. Pitt, not acknowledging the MMT perspective, telling the false story that taxes pay for spending, when taxes, of course, do not pay for spending. So the analysis that comes out of the idea that we have such a shortfall in tax revenue over this period of time is a different analysis when we apply the MMT lens to it than we would use if we were not applying the MMT lens to it. Using the MMT lens, we know that this the tax evasion has resulted in a failure to drain money out of the economy that otherwise would have been drained. But of course, we don't know where that economy now sits. If it is sitting, in overseas accounts, then of course it has left our economy in any case. But if it is sitting unreported in U.S. accounts that are masked from the IRS somehow, then it is still in the economy, reducing space for federal spending. And it would be important if we could know whether this is sitting outside of the economy, idle somewhere, so is not affecting things, or whether it's contributing to inflationary spending here. Recognizing, of course, that we've had very little inflation here. So these are some of the considerations that come out of applying the MMT lens to this particular story. Moving to a second story. This one relates to the infrastructure bill that the president evidently would like to pass. News of that bill was leaked to the press, probably deliberately as a trial balloon. This is an article from Common Dreams on Monday, March 22nd. Even Manchin called for $4 trillion, unquote. Progressives say Biden's infrastructure plan falls short. This one is by Jessica Corbett, staff writer at Common Dreams. And it talks about Biden's administration being hard at work on a long-awaited infrastructure plan. And when the news was leaked, advocacy groups on the progressive side responded critically on Monday to reporting about the legislation's possible $3 trillion price tag, warning it is not enough. The Biden team's infrastructure proposal signals what the climate justice movement has been saying for decades. To stop climate change, we need to scale up public investment to create millions of good jobs, build up our renewable infrastructure, and take care of our communities, said Ellen Cialis, or maybe Cialis, I'm not sure how she pronounces her name, the press secretary of the Sunrise Movement. And Kenyella Eng from People's Action, who's been a former candidate for Congress in Hawaii, it's a quote from him as well, quote, even Manchin has expressed support for a $4 trillion recovery plan because it is obvious that all of our communities need massive investment and structural change, unquote. Cialis continued, quote, but while this recommendation would be a huge step forward, the crises we face demand at least $1 trillion per year over the next decade. If you recall, I was saying Bernie Sanders, $16 trillion wasn't going to be enough 2 years ago, if you recall. And even if you don't, that is what I was saying. When Biden first started talking about maybe $4 trillion for infrastructure some time ago, $4 trillion plan over 4 years or something like that, the Sunrise Movement was pretty complimentary about that at that time. You aren't hearing about we face demand at least $1 trillion per year over the next decade. That's new from the Sunrise Movement, even though $1.6 trillion per year was in Bernie's platform. Anyway, Cialis says, quote, $3 trillion is simply not enough to create jobs in the national interest, combat the climate crisis, and support working people, unquote. And Kenyella Eng said he was encouraged to see Biden driving forward his campaign promise to create millions of good jobs to tackle the climate crisis. And then he made the statement that $3 trillion is not enough to address the scale. The critique was echoed by Claire Guzdar, campaign manager and spokesman for Prosper US, a coalition of more than 75 of the progressive organizations. And there's a quote from her in this article. Sunrise Movement said even Joe Manchin, who's fighting for $4 trillion, knows that $3 trillion is not enough for infrastructure. Here's a picture of some wind turbines. And according to the New York Times, one of the outlets that reported on the two-part plan based on unnamed sources, the first piece under discussion, which some Biden officials consider more appealing to Republicans, business leaders, and many moderate Senate Democrats, would combine investments in manufacturing and advanced industries with what would be the most aggressive spending yet by the United States to reduce carbon emissions and combat climate change, unquote. As the Times detailed, it would spend heavily on infrastructure improvements, clean energy deployment, and the development of other high-growth industries of the future, like 5G telecommunications. It includes money for broadband for rural areas, advanced training for millions of workers, and 1 million affordable and energy-efficient housing units. Documents suggest it will include nearly $1 trillion in spending alone on the construction of roads, bridges, rail lines, ports, electric vehicle charging stations, and improvements to the electric grid and other parts of the power sector. The second plan on discussion is what many progressives call the nation's human infrastructure. It's what I called the care economy yesterday. Students, workers, and people left on the sidelines of the job market, according to documents and people familiar with the discussions. It would spend heavily on education and on programs meant to increase the participation of women in the labor force by helping them balance work and caregiving. It includes free community college, universal pre-K education, a national paid leave program, and efforts to reduce child care costs. The package is expected to include $200 billion for housing infrastructure, $60 billion for green transit, and $46 billion for climate-related R&D, according to the Washington Post. The Post added that Biden is also expected to be presented with a menu of tax actions by Treasury officials to fund the plan. Biden campaigned on raising the corporate tax rate from 21% to 28%, as well as increasing taxes on wealthy investors. It was not immediately clear which of his tax plans would be included in the final bill. Jen Psaki did not address details in a statement on Monday. She's talking about them reforming the tax code so it rewards work and not wealth. I'd certainly like to see that happen, but I ain't holding my breath. And Waleed Shahid says Biden is proposing $60 billion on green transit right after at AOC and at E. Warren just called for $500 billion on green transit. Okay, and there we go. So more discussion of if Biden's bill is smaller than Joe Manchin, he must be obvious to people that it's not adequate, because it should be obvious that Joe Manchin's is certainly not adequate. I suppose that's the reasoning there. But, of course, there are many plans out, and most of them are much in excess of $3 trillion or even $4 trillion. And the ones that really try to handle the problem are at least $16 trillion and above. So, what's an MMT perspective on this? One MMT perspective, one thing that comes out of MMT might be, well, why is this plan so relatively small in terms of amount to spend? Why is it only $3 trillion over 4 years? Why isn't it 10 trillion over 10 years? Why isn't it 16 trillion? Why not? Are there some precepts of austerity economics still lurking in the background here? Are people in this administration still trying to conciliate Larry Summers and economists such as that, who gave the administration such a tough time when they passed the $1.9 trillion bill? Why did Biden say earlier that he was going to do 4 trillion and even speculated about 5 trillion? And now suddenly he's at 3 trillion. What's causing that? What MMT would suggest is you figure how much it's going to cost over 10 years to get rid of fossil fuels by 2030, put us on net zero carbon emissions by 2030, which is where we have to get. You figure out what we have to do that. You figure out how much it's going to cost, and that's the size of your infrastructure program. And then you put aside another 5 trillion for cost overruns, or another 10 trillion for cost overruns, and you fund that over 10 years. It's not so bad. It's only 2 trillion a year on the average, and meanwhile, during this time, our economy will be expanding. It'll probably be doubling. So instead of being at $22 trillion, by the end of the 10 years, it'll be at $44 trillion. It'll probably average $33 trillion. So what's 20 trillion over 10 years, an average of $2 trillion a year out of 33 trillion? Well, it's a good deal less than 10% a year, maybe 6% a year, 6 2/3% a year. We can afford that if it's an existential crisis, right? We can afford that. If we were in a world war, we might spend 50% of GDP, 50% on a war effort. We spent at that scale in World War II. 6% a year, 5% a year. From an MMT perspective, that's peanuts. You spend what you have to spend to solve the problem. The government can do that kind of spending. You tax what you have to tax, not for revenue, but to create space in the economy for federal spending so resources are not used up that are needed for the infrastructure program. If there's no shortage of resources for the infrastructure program, then you don't have to tax specifically for that. You just have to tax in order to drain the economy of reserves that might cause inflation, that might cause bottlenecks in certain areas, which would lead to demand pull, to supply push inflation. So that's what an MMT outlook would suggest here. It would not suggest that we're calling for 4 trillion or 3 trillion. Okay, what it would suggest is we're calling for this kind of program. And we've estimated that this program will cost what it's going to cost to solve the problem. And that number is, it should be a number large enough that the Sunrise Movement would be quite happy with it. In fact, the Sunrise Movement is nowhere near as capable as the government is of estimating how much that is going to cost. But 2 trillion or 3 trillion a year? It is not out of the question, okay, at all. Next, guess what happened? Democrats unveiled a bill which Democrats? Senator Markey. This was from Friday, March 19th, 2021, by Kenny Stansel. And the bill was introduced by Ed Markey. It's for building green infrastructure and having jobs, creating jobs. Would invest $500 billion over 10 years in state, local, and tribal projects to galvanize the transition to all-electric public transportation, reducing climate-damaging greenhouse gas emissions and health-threatening air pollution, while expanding clean mass transit and creating up to 1 million new jobs. It's modeled after the Department of Transportation's Build Grant program. $500 billion over 10 years is only $50 billion a year. It's really a piddling bill. It's for creating good-paying jobs, quote unquote. And it was introduced by Senator Warren, Senator Markey, and Representatives Andy Levin of Michigan and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, of New York. And Warren says, the climate crisis is an existential threat to our planet, but it's also a once-in-a-generation opportunity to rebuild our crumbling infrastructure, create 1 million good new jobs, and unleash the best of American innovation. And doing that is worth only $50 billion a year? I mean, what dictated that $50 billion a year figure? The $500 billion over 10-year figure? How'd they come up with that? The Bill Green Act, she added, that's what you ask from an MMT perspective. That's the first thing you ask. Why is that so small? Is there some justification in terms of the scale of the problem for arriving at $50 billion? Now, some of you may say, well, we weren't hearing this a few years back. It's really exemplary. They came out with a bill for $50 billion a year. But an MMT perspective would not suggest that. It would suggest, look, give me a problem analysis, come up with a solution, cost out the solution, put that in your bill, but make sure the scale of the project fits the solution. Make sure the number that comes out emerges from the solution, not from some arbitrary thing saying, well, $500 billion over 10 years doesn't sound like too much. Doesn't sound like too much. Only $50 billion a year? I mean, that's only $1 billion per state on the average. And that doesn't include the tribes. So what the hell is going on? Only $1 billion for states to galvanize the transition to all-electric public transportation? For God's sakes, the states don't create their own money. I mean, maybe more like $500 billion a year. Jesus Christ. The climate crisis is an existential threat to our planet. Yeah, you're really acting like it's an existential threat. Co-sponsors of the legislation, supported by almost 3 in 5 Americans, according to a new poll conducted by Data for Progress. So they coordinated this with a poll. I wonder what it would have been like, what the results of the poll would have shown if you gave the people choices. 50 billion a year on the average, 75 billion a year on the average, 500 billion a year on the average for the states to galvanize the movement to a green infrastructure. I wonder what people have said in the poll then. I don't think that was in the poll, folks. Co-sponsors included Bernie. Hey, Bernie, that doesn't square with your $16 trillion climate emergency platform. This doesn't. So how'd you come up with it? And Representatives Jan Schakowsky, Pramila Jayapal, Ayanna Pressley. Sorry, I scrolled down here a little too fast, lost my place. Rashida Tlaib, Mandir Jones, and Jamal Bowman, among others. Alluding to the recent crisis in Texas caused by the collision of a deregulated fossil fuel-dependent energy system and a climate change winter storm, Ocasio-Cortez said that we must stop spending billions of taxpayer money on infrastructure systems only for them to fail at the crucial moment. Yes, we must. So guess what? Don't underfund them. Don't underfund them. I mean, how much are you going to give Texas? Maybe the Texas share is going to be $5 billion out of this, and the California share may be $7 billion. I got news for you. That's not enough to do very much in Texas. It's not enough to do very much in California. Only $7 billion. How much is going to be for New York? Maybe $4 billion? $3.5 billion? Drop in the bucket for New York. The Build Green Act, Ocasio-Cortez continued, helps ensure that our federal dollars are being invested in infrastructure. In most of the country, she added, subways, buses, and other public transit are practically inaccessible or completely overburdened. She's right. So do something about it. Don't play around with messaging bills. Come in with bills that would likely solve the problem. So all the sentiments expressed here are very good. But this bill does not meet the scale of the problem. They claim the Infrastructure and Job Act, better utilizing investments to leverage development and generating renewable energy to electrify the nation's Build Green Infrastructure and Jobs Act would, bullet point 1, jumpstart the transition to all-electric public transportation, expand clean mass transit to underserved communities, and help modernize our crumbling infrastructure by covering up to 85% of costs for eligible state, local, and tribal projects, with an option for the Secretary of Transportation to cover 100% of costs. You just look at that first bullet point. Does it seem reasonable to you that $50 billion a year could cover 85 to 100% of the costs? Reduce carbon emissions by an estimated 21.5 million metric tons of CO2 annually, or the equivalent of taking 4.5 million combustion engine cars off the road. Sorry, folks, not enough. Take a look at the gigaton initiative. Oh, I'm sorry, the teraton initiative sometime. That's not enough to take off the roads. To prevent an estimated 4,200 deaths annually by reducing significant sources of local air pollution that cause adverse health effects like asthma, and avert 100 billion annually in health costs. And that's only worth 50 billion a year. Come on. Start to correct decades of health disparities and environmental injustice. By dedicating at least 40% of all funding projects in frontline vulnerable and disadvantaged communities, and create up to 1 million good new jobs with strong labor protections. Ay, ay, ay. I'm sorry, friends. This does not meet the scale of the problems they're trying to address. Now, of course, they're going to say, well, they don't mean to meet the whole problem. There's going to be other legislation too. But where? Where is it as part of the program? This is the Bill Green Act. No, this does not meet the scale of the problem. They didn't work hard enough. I don't think Warren and her staff know enough about green stuff. Get in some people who really know what they're talking about and really cost this out in a serious way. And the MMT perspective, of course, suggests, in the same way that it did in the 4 trillion versus 3 trillion versus more trillions discussion, suggests that this is a laughingly small bill in terms of what we can afford. Even if the whole thing were deficit spent, it's only 50 billion a year of deficit spending, when we probably have room for 3 trillion a year in deficit spending. What are they going to do to get the other 2.5 trillion we need to have a full employment economy? What the hell are they thinking of? I don't know. But the MMT perspective suggests they weren't thinking from an MMT perspective. Here's a post. Am I sharing this yet? Let me see. Yeah, I guess I am. Here's a post by Ryan Cooper. How earmarks can help fix Congress. And this is from March 22nd, 2021. And it's from the week. And Ryan says, the House of Representatives has repealed its decade-old ban on earmarks, which allow individual representatives to direct money towards projects in their districts. The idea has been, quote, pushed by Democrats trying to entice Republicans to support a major infrastructure package and other spending bills. Now, what's this about? It's about, in a fit of virtue, some time ago, the Democrats wanted to cut out pork. Earmarks, of course, the argument against them, says Cooper, is that they enable, quote, wasteful, unquote, spending, like the infamous, quote, bridge to nowhere, okay, in Alaska, that we heard about roughly about a decade ago. It was a great scandal because one of the senators, okay, from Alaska wanted to build a bridge to nowhere. because he just wanted to bring home some pork and some jobs, okay, to Alaska. Ryan goes on, but this is great news. Earmarks grease the wheels of politics, and they help tie the United States as a functioning society. Finally, reporters and analysts begin to appreciate the virtues of good old pork. Pork's important. It's important for trading. It's important for getting around the filibuster. It's important for putting together 60 votes for things, if you needed 60 votes. It's even important in putting together 50 votes for things. For example, if there were a little pork in the Reconstruction bill, maybe Joe Manchin would have allowed the minimum wage in. Maybe we could have gotten the minimum wage. Wouldn't that have been worth $10 billion in pork? That's probably what it would have cost. Just a little pork. Would the pork have gone to waste in West Virginia? I don't think so. There are two big reasons the objections to earmarks are wrong. Most obviously, this last earmark-free decade saw a stupendous amount of wasteful infrastructure spending. It just came in the form of high prices, incompetent feather bedding contractors, idiotic designs, and so on. The East Side Access and Second Avenue projects in New York City are probably the most expensive pieces of subway ever built in history and took at least a decade longer than they should have. The California high-speed rail project from Los Angeles to San Francisco saw such severe cost bloat that it all but killed the project. Overall, Americans pay something like an order of magnitude more than peer nations for our infrastructure. The supposed worst-case earmark scenario of a few swing state representatives or senators getting themselves a few fancy bridges or whatever they don't strictly need would be a trivial issue. The real American problem with infrastructure is we can't build anything anymore for a reasonable price or in a reasonable time. I think this started with the big dig in Boston in the early 2000s, didn't it? More broadly, the definition of wasteful spending mentioned above carries toxic neoliberal assumptions. John McCain's famous crusade against earmarks was classic austerity politics, trying to demonstrate his moral virtue through a crusade against government spending, which was assumed to be wasteful by definition. By this view, whether some community needs infrastructure is typically defined with reference to what can be used immediately. Crowded trains need more cars. Full airports need to be expanded, and so on. It would thus be easy to, quote, prove, unquote, that Detroit does not need a big investment in, say, public transit because its population has been declining for 70 years. In reality, this is backwards. Detroit's population has crashed because it has been starved of investment and because it ended up on the wrong side of neoliberal trade deals that cored out its industrial base. We want infrastructure to be used, of course, but we also want it to tie the United States together as a functioning polity, again, so long as we are paying reasonable prices. We do not want concentrated, festering economic dysfunction, to pick a random example, to fuel the political career of a racist demagogue. Wonder who that could be. As Steve Randy Waldman has written, this point applies especially to transportation. If Cincinnati has abundant and cheap air transportation capacity, that will remain whether it is fully utilized or not. Firms in New York City and DC and San Francisco will start thinking about how they can take advantage of the lower costs of those regions. When decisions about transportation capacity are left to private markets, there's a winner-take-all dynamic that takes hold that is understandable and reasonable from a business perspective, but is contrary to the national interest. It's a cliche, we would say the public purpose. It's a cliche that the government builds, quote, bridges to nowhere, unquote, that the private sector never would build. That's true. And it's a credit to the public sector. Bridges to nowhere are what turn nowheres into somewheres. We need many, many more bridges to nowhere. That's from the Interfluidity blog of Steve, by Randy Waldman. A similar argument applies to politics. The Republican Party is currently radicalizing against the very idea of democracy and is engaged in a vast conspiracy to rig the 2022 midterms through Jim Crow-style tactics. Couldn't agree more. Crucial to this effort is a constant fire hose of incendiary lies that actually Democrats are the ones trying to steal elections to justify Republicans doing it first. Thus, the, quote, stop the steal, unquote, rally before Trump's putschists stormed the Capitol building on January 6th. That is a big reason why congressional Republicans voted against Biden's pandemic relief bill in lockstep, despite it being immensely popular. They have to pretend that Democrats are evil incarnate to justify their own awful actions. But insofar as some Republicans can be tempted into getting juicy projects for their local communities by voting for a Democratic infrastructure package, which is reportedly not out of the question, this will tend to deflate the perception of Democrats as Satan-worshipping pedophiles. It is hard to justify a pose of frothing hatred towards someone one moment when the next you're voting for their bill to get some money for bridge repairs. Of course, earmarks will not be some tragic solvent, a magic solvent, that stops Republican extremism in its tracks, and their capacity for hypocrisy should never be underestimated. But every little bit helps on the margin. Politics will become more about actually negotiating, catering to the needs of one's constituents, and boasting about real accomplishment, and less about imaginary doomsday conspiracy theories. There may be even better effects in the Democratic Party. For years, conservative Democrats, like Senator Joe Manchin, West Virginia, have performed their moderation by hacking away at popular bills to make them worse. This was part of the austerity politics tradition, but that is seemingly dying, with Manchin half-heartedly nipping away at President Biden's pandemic relief bill more out of habit than anything else. I don't know if it was so half-hearted when he went after the minimum wage, but that's another thing. By contrast, there are statues all across West Virginia of Senator Robert Byrd, Manchin's predecessor in the Senate, because Byrd's political career was based on doling out federally funded projects across the state. It was. I remember well those days. I remember when the agency known as UMTA, the Urban Mass Transportation Agency, when that agency was supporting huge mass transportation projects in Charleston, West Virginia, very, very modern stuff going up to Charleston, West Virginia, because that would get Byrd's support and Byrd's votes. And by the way, it was a good thing for Charleston, West Virginia at the time. But West Virginia then was not nearly so poor as it is now. Congress inarguably worked better when those kinds of deals were common. An earmark building high-speed rail service from Charleston, West Virginia to D.C. might not be the most perfect possible way to spend money, but it would absolutely be worth a Senate vote, and it would provide economic help to a state that badly needs it. I couldn't agree more. So let's all join round the congressional pork barrel and demand our congressional representatives bring home the bacon. And what perspectives would be useful in determining whether we can afford that particular bacon or not in every state of the union, and whether or not we can afford whatever bacon seems appropriate to spend upon at that particular time. Why? It's the MMT lens. Okay, of course. We know very well we can afford considerable pork barrel in the green infrastructure bill. Considerable pork barrel. We could afford 10% of it as state and local pork barrel. Not $500 billion a year. I shouldn't say $500 billion a year. Not $500 billion over 10 years. More like, I don't know, $1.5 trillion over 10 years. How's that sound for pork barrel? Don't quote me on that. I haven't really costed this out. But my point is that can be very useful in passing the bills we need to meet the climate crisis. And the sooner we get to realizing that, the better off we're going to be. And here is a post from Dave Dayen, one of my favorite columnists. And guess what this post is about? It's about the ever-loving post office. It's about Louis DeJoy. And guess what? It's a revelation. The Postal Transformation Plan has Democratic board support. Why? Who were the Democrats appointed to that board? Dave says, congressional Democrats came out firing against Postmaster General Louis DeJoy's long-promised 10-year plan to revolutionize the Postal Service. Quote, a draconian plan that guarantees the death spiral of the United States Post Office, said Representative Jerry Connolly, Democrat of Virginia, one district over from where I am now. Quote, unacceptable, unquote, and should not be implemented, offered House Oversight Committee Chair Carolyn Maloney, Democrat of New York. Quote, I am not sure about how our postal workers, who remain on the front lines of our national COVID response, can view DeJoy's plans as anything other than a gratuitous slap, unquote, said Stephen Lynch, Democrat of Massachusetts. The actual mail unions made up of those postal workers on the front lines were gentler. The National Association of Letter Carriers opened by noting many positive elements and ultimately called the plan, quote, a good starting point, unquote, despite, quote, obvious concerns with certain operational elements, unquote. The American Postal Workers Union, the most vocal about DeJoy and restoration of the Postal Service mission, took a half-hearted approach, saying, quote, there are elements of this plan the APWU will support, and there are elements of the plan we oppose, unquote. The biggest thing to me in the 58-page plan was the introductory letter from DeJoy and the chair of the Postal Service Board of Governors, Democrat, by Ron Bloom. Him and the other Democrats on the board, and the other Democrat on the board, Donald Moak, appear to be fully on board with these changes. And even if and when 3 other Democrats join them for majority on the board, I'm not sure that firing DeJoy, despite the abominable performance since he became Postmaster General, is on the agenda. On whose agenda? The point here is that it needs to be on Biden's agenda. It needs to be on Biden's agenda. And if it was on Biden's agenda, he'd fire the whole board and appoint people who want to change the mission of the post office again. And what he would do is make the Postmaster General, give the Postmaster General some special status within the federal government while he tries to pass a bill making the post office once more a department of the cabinet of the United States. Screw this post office that's trying to work as a private sector company. That's not necessary. The mail is a public service. It's full operation to provide services to all the people of the United States and go the last mile at whatever cost is a public service that was characteristic of the United States until Nixon ended that in 1971. That is the source of this continuous austerity against the post office. It has to stop. We have to change it back. We have to forget the last 50 years as a Republican neoliberal experiment and make the post office a part of the government again. Not an independent agency, not dependent on its own financing, funded the same way the military is funded the same way HHS is funded, out of general revenues. We need the post office to be nonprofit again, assiduously nonprofit, fanatically nonprofit, about service to all of us. And screw Federal Express, and screw UPS, and screw the private sector mail services. We need our Department of the Post Office back. Going on with this particular article. And when 3 other Democrats joined them for a majority on the board, I'm not sure that firing DeJoy, despite the abominable performance since he became Postmaster General, is on the agenda. That's why the postal unions aren't going scorched earth on this plan, because they know they're going to have to deal with it. Let's let them know they're not going to have to deal with it. Let's cut the plan and make the post office a department of the government again. Unless President Biden heeds the call of Representative Bill Pascrell and others to fire the entire postal board and start anew with someone who will fire DeJoy, some version of this plan is coming to a post office near you. Let us stop it, folks. What does that mean? The goal is to eliminate a projected $160 billion operating deficit over the next 10 years. Why eliminate that? Why eliminate that? It's only $16 billion a year. The government can't afford to provide $16 billion to the post office out of what's likely to be a $5 or $6 trillion budget. Of course it can. And that operating deficit over the next 10 years. Does that include what they have to put aside the retirement fund, the 75-year retirement fund? That is nonsense. There are improvements to the package delivery network alongside degradations to letter delivery. First-class mail would take longer to reach its intended target, up to 5 days in some cases. Screw that. Many of us are still sending in bills. Bill payments, I should say. Rates would almost certainly be higher, perhaps much higher for stamps. And there would be shorter hours, aligning retail hours to meet customer needs. Bull, we need longer hours for the post office, not shorter hours for the post office. And how about those people who work all night? And consolidation, closing of low traffic branches, stations, and plants. Why do we need to do that? The internal network changes seem like an extension of what DeJoy has already put in place, to disastrous results. More mail would move through surface transportation and air because USPS controls ground shipping, which is a bizarre return to the Pony Express era. And I'm very wary of allowing pop-up kiosks for other businesses inside post offices, essentially renting out valuable public space. Me too, very wary. There are more positive changes. There's $40 billion of capital investment in this plan, including $4 billion to modernize retail post offices, technology upgrades, and a vow to fully electrify the postal fleet by 2035. Screw that. Do it by 2030. The plan says it could be done faster with an $8 billion investment from Congress. Peanuts. Just peanuts. They're talking peanuts. This is the post office. For God's sake. Saturday delivery is maintained. Services to direct mail and e-commerce businesses will be increased. Post offices will become a storefront for government services like passport photos and notary signatures. I didn't notice any postal blanking. There's some very ominous talk about doing fingerprint and biometric capture in the plan. Screw that. There's an expansion of P.O. boxes in certain areas and a move to street-style addressing, which would allow for package delivery. I had been hearing rumors that DeJoy might even endorse postal banking in a bid to save his job, but there's none of that in here. The ATWU statement says they will continue to advocate for it. Finally, there are some benefits for workers, although cutting hours and consolidating facilities will obviously hurt some of them. There's a commitment to reduce turnover by 50% and to convert thousands of employees to career status. That's good. There's a role for Congress to pass legislation that integrates employees into Medicare and ends the ridiculous pre-funding requirement that has no precedent anywhere in the public or private sector. Those two changes alone fill over 1/3 of the funding gap and even more over the long term. This could have been worse, but unless there's a change of heart on the Board of Governors, we're probably stuck with some iteration of this plan and with DeJoy, someone who can't really be trusted to pull off even the most optimistic version of this report. So, where does MMT fit in there? Well, that is so obvious. Returning the post office to become a part of the government again, and to be even a cabinet level appointment again, as was always the case, to give it some status, that would be cheap. We are saving nothing by having the post office as a private agency. Look at what they're talking about. $160 billion deficit over 10 years' time. $16 billion a year for the post office. $16 billion a year. You think The Postal Service of the United States isn't worth $60 billion a year in funding, direct funding from the federal government to supplement its costs that it already pays for? I think it is. I think it is $60 billion a year for the post office. Just to have post offices really convenient again, not too far from people. I mean, hell, you could build post offices and make a part of them like Starbucks. People go in for coffee and do their postal work. You can make them internet cafes. I'm joking, of course, in part. But I'm very serious. There was no need to try to semi-privatize the post office. And there's no need to pursue that kind of plan any further. It was a flawed premise. It was a mistake. Let us end it and bring back the good old days when the president had some patronage through the post office. It's better for the presidency. It's better for the country. It's better for all the local areas. It's better for the small towns. And it's cheap. It's cheap. MMT's perspectives say, there's nothing. This is nothing. We can make this up. It's nothing. If it gets rolling, it won't even be deficit spending for this if the economy gets rolling. I mean, the post office itself, by building up infrastructure more in other areas, might stimulate enough economic activity to pay for itself. I mean, this is crazy, people. It's just crazy. And MMT tells you it's crazy. So finally, and you're going to laugh at this one. I have no idea this is true. This is from Axios. And it is an article that's written actually by Mike Allen and Jim Vandehei. Two more establishment mainstream people you will never find. I don't know whether to believe this or not, but I certainly hope it's true. It's entitled Biden's New Deal, Re-Engineering America Quickly, and it's dated 15 hours ago, which by my clock is 7 o'clock in the morning Eastern Time. There's a picture of Smokey Joe. President Biden recently held an undisclosed East Room session with historians that included discussion of how big is too big and how fast is too fast to jam through once-in-a-lifetime historic changes to America. Why it matters. The historian's views were very much in sync with his own. It's time to go even bigger and faster than anyone expected. If that means chucking the filibuster and bipartisanship, so be it. 4 things are pushing Biden to jam through what could amount to a $5 trillion plus overhaul of America and vast changes to voting, immigration, and inequality. Why $5 trillion all of a sudden? We were just hearing $3 trillion. Why the $3 trillion? Maybe the $3 trillion was thrown out so there would be loud outcries about how the $3 trillion was not enough. so he could start talking about the 5 trillion. You know, they play these games all the time. And maybe this is another leak now. Well, what about 5 trillion? Is that a little better? I got news for them. From an MMT perspective, one should probably say, no, it's still not enough. It's good. We're encouraged by the fact that you're responding. But you got to do a lot more than that. Why not 5 trillion over 2 years? And then we'll reconsider the matter 2 years from now when we see how big the problem really is. 4 things. 1, he has full party control of Congress and a short window to go big. 2, he has party activists egging him on. Make that MMT activist too. He has strong gathering economic winds at his back. And he's popular in polls. And he might have added, austerity ain't very popular right now. Even a hint of austerity isn't very popular right now. Presidential historian Michael Beschloss told Axios, FDR and LBJ may turn out to be the past century's closest analogs for the Biden era. Quote, in terms of transforming the country in important ways in a short time, unquote. Beschloss said the parallels include the New Deal economic relief that Franklin Roosevelt brought in 1933, which saved the country from the Depression and chaos. And Biden is on track to leave the country in a different place, as Lyndon Johnson did with his Great Society programs. Well, as he would have done if he hadn't squandered all kinds of things with the Vietnam War. His momentum on the domestic front was really squandered by the Vietnam War. People close to Biden tell us he's feeling bullish on what he can accomplish and is fully prepared to support the dashing of the Senate's filibuster rule to allow Democrats to pass voting rights and other trophy legislation for his party. He loves the growing narrative that he's bolder and bigger thinking than President Obama. This temptation to go even bigger. Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell insists will create such a fissure between the parties that he compared it this week to, quote, nuclear winter, unquote. But we're told that Biden won't hesitate, just as he passed the $1.9 trillion COVID rescue package with 0 Republican votes and 0 regrets. His team sees little chance he's going to be able to rewire the government in his image if he plays by the rules of bringing in at least 10 Republicans. I want to call your attention once again to the idea that he loves the growing narrative that he's bolder and bigger thinking than President Obama. All I can say is, I really hope that is not bullshit. I want to know he has a personal, ego-driven type of motivation to leave a legacy that submerges Obama underneath a mound of austerity crap, because that's what he deserves. His team sees little chance he's going to be able to rewire the government in his image if he plays by the rules of bringing in at least 10 Republicans. He won't rub their noses in it, we're told. That will be the Biden touch to rolling the opposition and getting that much closer to the status of latter-day FDR. Closer to the status? As I recall, what FDR did was to rub the Republicans' noses in it for all the years that he was the president of the United States. That's what he did. Biden's list includes rural broadband expansion, which would be transformative for those communities, make child tax credit permanent, landmark legislation on climate, guns, okay, and voting. That's a terrific agenda, folks. I'd like to see Medicare for all on that agenda too, and I don't see it. But what there is a very, very good agenda. And who knows, if the voting comes quick, if that comes quick, and the climate stuff comes quick, and the gun stuff comes quick, then maybe there's going to be space, political space, to do the Medicare for all too. Maybe that, okay, is going to happen too. So, I'm going to consider your comments, okay, in just a moment. But what happened here? Did I mix something? Okay, tomorrow night, in part, what I'll be talking about is I'll be continuing, okay, along this vein to talk about plans which the Democrats seem to have now to go after the filibuster. That will be part of the agenda for tomorrow night. Okay. In addition to that agenda for tomorrow night, for that piece of the agenda tomorrow night, there's news about the unveiling of the ABC Act. In other words, the ABC Act has come back, the Automatic Boost to Community Act. There'll be more against the war against the Postal Service. And there's going to be stuff on Democratic plans to blow the filibuster up, okay, as well, because there's news on that. So tomorrow is going to be a very interesting show. But let us get to tonight's comments. Lana says, was just listening to Bernie Town Hall about the wages. And go start, put some sort of icon in, which I can't read through my interface. Kay calls out to Evelina. And Bonnie says hi to everyone. Kay says there was a great live stream today by Patriotic Millionaires. Kelton was a speaker in it. Yeah, I knew that was going to happen, but didn't have time to watch it. I figured I could see it, okay, on YouTube afterwards. Bonnie said hi, everyone. And Kay said they should be taxed anyway. Balana says I like Kenyella Ing. Okay, or ang. If I recall correctly, it is ing. Ing. Yes, I like him too. He was very, very good. And as I recall, he knew a bit of MMT too. Start says, at Dan Price, Seattle 22. If we just collected all the taxes the 1% owes but doesn't pay, we'd have 1.75 trillion over a decade. The cost to wipe out student debt is 1.7 trillion. Right, but of course we can wipe out student debt in any case, whether or not we collect those taxes. Now, I'm certainly for collecting those taxes, but I never want to contend that those taxes are going to pay to wipe out student debt. Most of the student debt, okay, is owned by the government. When those payments are made to the government for the student debt, those payments drain reserves out of the economy. They take money away from people who would otherwise spend it into the economy. What the government is doing by not wiping out student debt is it's depressing a part of the economy. It's depressing part of the private economy. I'm all for taking the 1.75 trillion back and for collecting it going forward, but only because we need to drain resources from the wealthy so they think twice. They think twice about using their wealth to undermine the political system. Now, that might make them get even more aggressive about trying to undermine the political system. But my reply to that would be to take more of their assets. Lana says, yeah, I was compelled to reply to Dan Price nicely as possible. Start says, stop saying we can't afford things and start asking why we refuse to do anything to inconvenience the rich or help people or learn MMT. Each one teach one. I'm all for inconveniencing the rich. Start. All for it. Or get used an example. Laugh out loud. Lana. I'm surprised you didn't. You're everywhere. Kay says, we need bullet trains everywhere. Kay says, it doesn't meet the scale, but at least it's a start. No. We got to tell them it doesn't meet the scale. If we tell them, oh, you've been good boys and girls, it's a start, that doesn't reinforce what they have to do. It really doesn't. They need to play to scale. We don't need them to play footsie with the mainstream. We need them to fight. We need them to fight. I hate it when AOC collaborates with Warren. Warren doesn't know how to fight. She doesn't really know how to inconvenience the rich. She's all talk and no action. Kay says, supply jobs nationwide and Dems will be good in the midterms, yes. Kay says, now all we need is single payers so people can go anywhere to get those jobs. Well, if those are jobs in the job guarantee plan, then there would be Medicare benefits that would go with the job guarantee plan straight up, at least if it's an MMT job guarantee plan. It would include Medicare benefits. So they would be able to go anywhere in order to get those jobs because they would have the health care coverage. Kay says, laugh out loud, love Dave Day. And Start says, the other white meat pork, you don't get any pudding until you eat your meat. Lana says, oh God, the joy, puke. Kay says, we need postal banking too. Terry Burke says, ducking in to share and invite. Been mopping up gallons of water everywhere, mopping up gallons of water. The hot water heater busted, so I'm running around like a chicken with my head cut off. Oh God, Terry, that's awful. So sorry to hear that, Terry. Terry says, thank you, dear lady. And Ghostart says, even his employees are doing postal on him. And the deputy postmaster general position has been vacant since June 2020. Fun fact, but the Joy has millions in stock in a USPS competitor. I figured. Terry says maybe Biden got a whiff, K of MMT. He's probably been getting whiffs from certain people. He certainly, if he wants to know about MMT, he can talk to Jared Bernstein, one of his favorite guys. Jared will give him a reasonably friendly view, K of MMT.
Biden could use this to
He will grant, they will have a point. Bonnie says, what happened to the very fast tube-like travel across the U.S. to L.A. in about 1 to 2 hours? I don't know if I ever heard of 1 to 2 hours, but supposedly vacuum tube transportation is one of Elon Musk's projects at this point.
If Biden encouraged it, would he go down in history for that?
Well, I'd much rather the federal government were to build that than Elon Musk. Elon Musk.
Okay.
Who needs to make Elon Musk even more wealthy? We got to break up Elon Musk. Catherine Toskarska says, doubt he doesn't already know it. Terry Brooks says, hi, Catherine. Thank you for coming. Catherine says, in Lake Havasu, Arizona this week, many people in stores without a mask. It's a scandal with all the deaths they've had in Arizona. Terry says, too soon, too soon. Catherine says, I am camped on BLM lands with thousands of other nomads. Kay says, Arizona is still the Wild West. Lived there and hated it. Terry Burke says, impressive. Trump flags still fly here. Kay says, some still here in Northeast Ohio, too. Terry says, he's still a threat if he stays healthy. Couldn't agree more. Catherine says, there's so much amazing beauty in the state. As long as you've got some air conditioning and some fuel. Kay says, not in the Phoenix area. Ghostart says, a series of tubes, hashtag internet. Terry says, great, let's contact Jared Bernstein and ask him if by any chance he did in fact tell Biden about MMT. Jared would never reveal that to us. Any communications he's had with Biden would remain confidential unless Biden wanted them to be leaked. So if Jared is letting slip any secrets about what's going on in the Biden administration, they are plants from the Biden administration. It won't be Jared conveying those confidences. They will be confidences that are deliberately being leaked by the administration, and they may not in fact be true either. For example, this leak, okay, that he's now looking at a $5 trillion bill. That's a leak. Catherine Tokarska says, not true. Arizona has cold parts as well. Flagstaff, Prescott gets snow. Yeah, Phoenix I avoid. Isn't Tucson also very hot and dry? Okay, I've actually been to Phoenix. Okay, I did. Years ago, I had contract work with the Farmers Home Administration. And we were doing basically what I'll call focus groups in various states in order to get at measurements of need in the counties of those states. And we held one of our sessions in Phoenix. And so I went out to Phoenix on that occasion. I also passed through on a number of other occasions, got to Tucson as well. But what I remember best about that part of the country is driving through Death Valley in an old car that was close to breaking down, with fortunately plenty of water, back in 1960. And I also remember taking some trips to Alamogordo, New Mexico, during the spring when it was just starting to get hot around there. And it was like 120 degrees. You didn't dare go anywhere without air conditioning. You just had to have the air conditioning. And Ghost Art says, nice to see more viewers. Welcome. Terry Bark says, okay, Dr. F. Top secret. Catherine Tokarska says, common misconception that the state of Arizona is all desert. Yes, I know it is a common misconception. I confess to it. And Kay says, Phoenix is overpopulated and air quality sucks most days. Catherine Tokarska says, avoid Phoenix. We are heading to Sedona next week, probably. What's the climate like in Sedona, Catherine? Catherine says, Death Valley is California. Yeah, I know it is. I know it's California. And Kay says, Upper Arizona is very different from Phoenix. And Terry Burke says, Arizona also has cinema. And Lana says, I lived in Phoenix while pregnant. That was those many years ago. Glad for the experience. Some nice folks, but I didn't like it that much. No desire to return. Agree. It's Wild West. No water, no. Part 2. Now, I love Minnesota. 11,000 lakes. Haha. Yeah, Minnesota is actually very pretty, but awfully cold in the winter. Catherine says it is cold now, so we wait till next week. It should warm up. Lana says, live in, not love in. Lana says, now, I love in Minnesota. Yeah. I immediately saw live. I didn't see love, and now I notice you did say love. Okay, folks. I think we've kind of come to the end. And Ghost Art says, Phoenix is like a grid. Just remember, streets run one way, avenues run the other. I got a delivery job. First week, no problem. Okay. Sounds good. And, but what is Missouri like? Terry Burke says. Dolores says, thank you and good night all.
Welcome to the new people.
And thank you and good night all. And welcome to all who came tonight. But I think everybody who came tonight has come before. And Kay says, thank you all for a great discussion. I love you all. And we love you, Kay. So good night, folks. I'm going to call my daughter now, wish her a happy birthday.